Good morning. Hamshach Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1353. Okay. So what we learned is yesterday, after explaining the meaning of ner mitzvah, and before that ner of the neshama, how they're similar to a candle. The three aspects of the candle: the wick, the fuel, the oil, and the fire that it produces, the light. The Rebbe Rasha began, "V'nira li levayer." To explain this, it appears to me, or it appears that we can explain this in the following way. And to do so, he went into is beginning a long discussion now on different levels of oir. Essentially, different forms of how light is generated and how light functions. So let's sum them up. He begins with oir, that begins with oir hariyah, the inyan of oir hariyah, how vision, how sight works. So we know sight is connected to light. First of all, you could only see in the light. Secondly, the eye is a translucent organ that allows light in the proper fashion. It regulates the light. That's how we see images. He discussed that there are different opinions of how the vision works. Here we only quoted one of three opinions, but he told us where Vayar Bolek, meaning in volume 1, there discusses a second opinion. There's also a third opinion. But here, relevant to us, is the opinion is that the eye so-called sends off light waves. And that allows us to see an image. Think of it something like the equivalent in sound would be sonic waves. Like when you want to know if there's a submarine down under the water, so you shoot sonic waves and you see if it bounces off things. You know, whales use sonic waves and sonic waves, right? So the point is, in sight, you could also say the same thing, that you have the eye sends off so-called nitzutze hayesim and ayin. There's a different opinion that the eye is like taking a snapshot of the object. But regardless, he's bringing this opinion because it's the one that is the strongest thing, that knows the eye does have an element of giving off light. However, makol mokim eina atzmi. That's the first opening statement. It's not an atzmi. What does an atzmi mean? An atzmi means something that is fundamental source of light, a luminary. Even though the eye can see and the eye may give off light, but as we're going to learn soon, not only does the eye not illuminate the darkness, without light, the eye can't see. And also the eye itself doesn't glow in the dark. So the first thing he's beginning with the hariyah, because he's going to come back to it later, to use it to understand what he wants to explain here. But in order from the top down, he now begins, let's talk about the different levels of that he did address here. So after hariyah, which was the opening, he started with hashemesh, the light of the sun, or he also compared haner, the light of a candle, because both of them are luminaries. Obviously, you can't compare them. The candle is a very small light, and the sun gives off tremendous, a much far greater form of light. Both, one thing they're common, they both are luminaries that give off light. They not only are bright, as we're going to discuss in a moment, but they also illuminate. So the way the Rebbe Rashab is discussing it, he's saying that oir hariyah is not like that. But in the process, I'll explain it in understanding the hierarchy, so to speak, the different levels of light. Then the next example he gives, the next form of light is havaka, the shine, the glow of a stone. There's havakas even teiv, habayir, like we discussed. There are glowing stones. There are stones that have properties that they glow. Now that's a lower level. Why? Because that glows, and an eye, and the eye does not glow in the dark. The truth is, in stones themselves, there are also levels. I'll soon discuss it. But regarding vision and sight, the stone is a greater, it's at least it glows, but a stone does not illuminate the dark. In most cases, definitely not like the sun. Like he says, so sun, going back to the levels now, the sun, the same thing with the candle, has, number one, it's bright, but not only is it bright, it also gives off brightness, gives off light that can illuminate a completely dark area. And not just a small dark area. The sun actually provides the whole daylight of the entire earth, even though the sun is so far hundreds of thousands of miles away. Okay, so far we talked about three levels here: the eye, the vision, the sun or candle, and a bright stone, a glowing stone. And I'm summing up what we learned. I'm not going to learn it inside again, just to get clarity. There's still more, so let's see how he goes now. I'm just going through the order. So actually, okay. Yeah. Right. So the Even Toiv is in between. It glows even in the night, but so it's Eir HaBohir, which means it's bright, it glows, but it's not an Eir HaMeir. It does not illuminate the darkness. Okay, Mashenken Eir HaShemesh is Lavad HaBehirus, besides being bright, it also illuminates. I'm just repeating what I said. Why is that the case? Because it's a Moyer Be'etzem, that's called an Atzmi. It was created to be that way. It's not due to the fact that a stone is a weaker form of light. It's two different creations. The sun was created to be a source, not just to be bright, but also to be a source of illuminating the darkness. Okay. But Eir Hariyah, Eina Eir HaMeiras HaCheshech, the vision and sight is not that way. It does not radiate darkness. And actually, in the place of darkness, you will not see. And it's also not an Eir Bohir. So sight is a form of light. It's not darkness because it does allow us to see, but it needs light and doesn't shine and glow on its own. So it's not like a shining stone, a glowing stone, and it's definitely not like the sun. That's the summation of that. Now, to explain that, the Rebbe Rashab went on and said that there are two forms of light, what he calls v'chinas chad v'nukva, mashpia and mekabel in oir. Before I continue, let me say this. This whole section in Ayin Beis is based on a Pirush HaMilas. The Mittler Rebbe has a sefer called Pirush HaMilas, where he explains, Pirush HaMilas literally means explanation of the meaning of the words in davening, in prayer. So Pirush HaMilas, chapter 48, a lot of the ideas here are taken from there. Additionally, an interesting sicha, a Simchas Torah, Tofrei Samach Zayin. That would be Simchas Torah 1906. There was a somewhat of a rebellion in the yeshiva in Temchet Mim in Lubavitch. The students did not want to, were not receptive to receiving from their mashpiyim. They wanted to learn on their own. They were somewhat a mutiny against the mashpiyim. I don't know to what extent, but we know there was some trouble. There were some tensions. So the Rebbe Rashab dedicated a sicha, a talk, that Simchas Torah, in Lubavitch to the Bachrim, where he talks at length about the Eira Mashpia and Eira Makabel. So very interesting. The ideas here are almost word for word, not word for word, but very, very similar to what he discusses there. The Eira Mashpia and Eira Makabel that we learned yesterday. So it's interesting to look at, to see comparative elements. There's some more points there that he doesn't bring here, some points he brings here that he doesn't bring there, but that was Samach Zayin. This is at least Ayin Vav, Ayin Zayin. This is 10 years later. But it's nevertheless similar ideas, and as I said, it originates from the Pirush HaMilas of the Rebbe, of the Mittler Rebbe. And I should also add that in volume 1, in the Maimer Podav Shalom Ayin Gimel, I believe, yeah, he also brings from that same Maimer from the Pirush HaMilas in talking about the light of the moon. Yeah, chapter 113 in the volume 1, page 219. So he also talks about the moon and the sun, which of course is relevant to our entire discussion in volume 3, as was mentioned yesterday, about the moon and the sun, which is moon is Malchus, the sun is Zah, Kili, Eir, and Helam, and so on, which we're going to discuss as we go along. But it's interesting, all this is still in the context of where he began talking about Torah, which is Torah Umay Lamata. And yet, he's now going back to understanding different types of light. So we'll connect it all as we go along. So be patient. Right now, he's developing different forms of light. So now he's introduced that there's light of Tchar v'Nukva. Tchar is Hamashpia. The sun is the classic example of a Hamashpia. That's how it was created. The sun is a giver, a transmitter. It's not a recipient. The moon is the classic example of Makabel. But as we're going to learn, it's a little more complicated than just giver and taker. As he explains in Torah Shalom, as I mentioned in the Sikha, and also here, generally you think Mashpia, Makabel, and Keli. The gives and the Keli receives. But as we're going to learn, the Makabel, it's Makabel. It's not just Makabel. We're not just talking about a recipient. We're talking about an energy of receptivity. So that means there's an energy also in the Makabel. The question is, how does that light stimulate it? And that's what he's going to explain now. There's actually so here is what he says. So summing up what we learned about that, he says, it has in its own power. The sun does not need to reach to anyone to get light. Obviously, God is the source of light in the sun too, but God created it in a way that now it has self-contained light. And even from a scientific point of view, it's burning. It's a burning entity that's constantly burning fuel and shining and glowing and giving off tremendous amount of energy and light and warmth and so on. So that's the sun. On a much smaller scale, but the same idea. It's just a matter of quantity. But this again, once you light a candle, it burns. As long as you have fuel and you have a wick, it burns on its own. It's not receiving, it's not reflecting, it's not a mirror, it's not like a moon, and so on. So it's called moir. So we don't call it oir, we call it moir. It's not light, it's the source of light. Obviously, it also has light within it. But it's important to keep this in mind, that it's more than just light, it's the source of light. For example, when you talk about a glowing stone, you wouldn't just call it a moir. You'd call it oir, perhaps, because it's glowing. But it's not a source of light that gives off light and illuminates darkness. Okay. The same thing of flame, fire, which could be referring to the candle, or it could be in general fire. It doesn't have to be a candle. It could also be a torch. It could be fire in general, fire burning. It's also moir. Fire, by its natural property of fire, is to give off light. And indeed, with Eish, it's actually interesting. Eish has the moir part of the shemesh, but it doesn't have the oir part. Because the Eish HaYesedi, the Ramban writes, like he says here, because Eish, not fire as we know it. The fire that we know is an actual fire. It does illuminate. If you light a fire in a dark forest, it's going to illuminate. Or even a candle illuminates. But there's another aspect. The Eish Yesedi, the archetype of fire, is not bright. So there we have now another category, that it's a source of brightness, of illumination, but it itself is not bright. It's like the opposite of a glowing stone. A glowing stone is bright, but it doesn't give off light. And Eish Yesedi gives off light, but it itself is not bright, the archetype part. The sun has both. That's what he says in the parentheses. So it has etzem ha'er, but it doesn't have era mispashet. Whereas the sun has both of those. So another category, even though I'm not, this is not an encyclopedia of every type of light, but as he's going along, it's important to quantify. So I'm trying to organize it in that fashion. Okay. What's nukva? What's the makabel in the world of oir? Remember, everything in existence has zachar v'nikeva, masculine and feminine properties, or masculine and feminine energy, which is mashpia makabel. So also in oir, what's the oir of makabel? So he says, it doesn't have the power on its own to illuminate. It's still oir. We'll soon understand what that means, that oir, but it doesn't have the power to illuminate. But rather, for it to give off light, it needs something else to feed it, so to speak, like the moon. Well, before the moon, he brings the example of seichel. So the makabel, the recipient, as we know, Exudes says, it's not like a father and a son. A child gets the very genes, and therefore the very matter of his brain is coming from his father, even though he's an independent entity. But the father is not just giving him intelligence, he's also giving him the genes that he has, as does the mother. A teacher and a student, the teacher does not give the brain to a student. The student has his own mind and brain. However, for it to start illuminating, and we're talking now not what he figures out on his own, but like he explains in the Torah Shalom, for him to really be a proper teacher and really understand an idea, he first has to be a sponge, a makabel to his mashpia. So he says like this in Seichel. But it doesn't radiate, and let's explain what that means. What does it mean? Of course, a student, even without meeting his teacher, he has intelligence, but true intelligence, how to think properly, how to truly understand the concept properly, requires a teacher. But when the teacher teaches him, he's not giving him his seichel, he's generating, and he's like a catalyst that stimulates and awakens the seichel in the student. So it's like, let's think of a music student. He could play music on his own. He has a talent, but he's not going to play properly. When he has a teacher, the teacher will teach him the methodology. Then that will be a catalyst that will stimulate the natural talent that the student has. So there's oil there, but unlike the sun gives off light without anything. It doesn't need a teacher. It doesn't need a mashpia. The moon, as we'll learn momentarily, is the opposite. It has oil, but the oil does not get stimulated and awakened. Essentially, it remains dormant until the sun touches it. And when the sun shines into the moon's light begins to shine. There is another opinion, just for the record, but that's not what he's addressing here, that the moon, all it is a reflector of sunlight. I think modern science would maybe say that. I'm not sure about this. But there is an opinion, which he's going with here, that the moon has its own light. However, that light is not generated, is not shining until the sun shines on it. So, for example, in a mirror, as he's going to an example of a mirror has no light of its own. A mirror reflects whatever comes its way. If it's light, it will reflect light. A moon has light of its own, but that light is not stimulated. It needs something to trigger it. And that's the light of the sun. So that's what he says here. And once he does have a mashpia, then he can start conceiving ideas of his own as well. And more than that, he could be mashpia on another. He himself becomes a mashpia. Even though he no longer is with his teacher, the seichel of the mashpia is no longer radiating. In other words, once it's been awakened in him in the proper way, now his mind is working. And he can become a mashpia. But it all began that he was a makabel first. And adrabah, the more distant he comes from his teacher, the more he can mashpia. Because as long as he's in the shadow of his teacher, he's not going to be mashpia properly. This we'll see soon as well. Okay, in the moon. And then he gives another example for this, which is also both in the Pirush HaMilas and the Sicha that I mentioned, Simchas Torah Tafrei Samar Zayin, like we see an actual male and female. Perfect example. Not perfect, but an example, a good example. A woman has the power to give birth. She has all the reproductive organs. She has the ability, she has a womb, she has an egg, an ovaries, and has the capacity to give birth. Like he says, Isha kisazriya yivayolda, when a woman will conceive and give birth. However, so there is a power there. She's not just a reflection of something else. However, she'll never give birth on her own if there isn't some stimulant, if there isn't a seed, that's a catalyst that plants a seed in there. And another example for this, The earth has power to grow vegetation. It's coming from the earth. It's not coming from anywhere else. But without rain, he doesn't mention here a seed, but there in those Maimarim that I'm mentioning, in those sources, he does mention also rain and seeds. The reason he doesn't mention a seed could be because there are things that grow in ground that don't need seeds. You see, even if you don't plant seeds in the ground, there will be weeds. There'll be many things that grow because the earth has the power of growth. But without rain, it will become arid and dry and nothing will grow. Or not even rain, there has to have some moisture, but if it's completely arid. So point being is that the earth has koyach etzemeach. However, that when the rain falls, that's what stimulates it. On the other hand, if you only have rain and you don't have the ground and the earth, that's like having a male without a female. That's also not going to give birth. And now he brings it back to the moon and the sun. Same thing with the moon now. So here too, there are two interpretations, and Exudes brings two interpretations. What does it mean that the moon or Malchus has nothing of its own? You could say it has nothing of its own literally, which means until the sun shines, it does not radiate. Like I said, the other opinion, that the moon is just like a mirror. And when there's the light of the sun, it reflects, or like he's explaining here, deeper. The moon has light, but the light does not shine on its own. So the Lesla Megamo Klum, as he's going to explain, means that as a shining light, it doesn't have anything of its own. But to say that it doesn't have the power of light, you can't say that. So he says, because the light of the moon is not coming from, it's not generated from within, because it has nothing. And yet, according to this explanation, you can't say it has no light at all, because we call it a moir. The Torah calls it a moir. Like it says, es ha-moir ha-gadol, es ha-moir ha-koten. God created two luminaries. And we don't say, if the moon was simply a reflector of the sun, how could you call it a moir? A moir, we said before, is a source of light. So why do we call Lesla Megamo Klum? Acha kavana. I'm reading from the top of page 1353. So what does it mean? Doesn't have anything. It means, what's the kavana? It doesn't have the illuminating element of light. It has a deep light within it, but that light stays in a state of dormant. It's like a concealed light. It needs something else to stimulate and get it going. The Ima Yesef B'chinas Moir, I'm reading line 2 and line 3, just summing up. Even though we just said it's a level of Moir, it's not just light, it's a source of light. It does not have the capacity to shine on its own, only after it receives from the sun. Like we said before with the student, or with the mother, or with the woman, or with the earth. And then once it is stimulated, it's shining with its own light, not with the sunlight, because then that light has become active, has become activated. Okay. Now, I'm going to go a little slow now. We learned this already, but because it's a little dense, a lot of aspects to it. So now we've introduced yet another form of light. Till now, we learned about the light of the eye, which we'll get back to sight and vision, which does not illuminate, but is connected to light. It does allow light in and allows us to see and so on. We talk about this, the glowing stone, which is bright but not illuminating, meaning illuminating darkness. Talked about the light of the sun or a flame or fire that is both bright and illuminating. Fire has an element that is the archetype of fire does not illuminate, but it's the source of light. In the parentheses he added. And now we've introduced the light of the moon. On one hand, it's a moir, it's a source of light, but it's not light of its own. So you can't compare the moon to a glowing stone. Of course, it's not like the sun. And the question is it like the light of the eye? We'll soon see how he juxtaposes those two, but let's not jump there yet. But it is Eira Makabel, and when another light shines into it, in this case, the light of the sun, it will to be stimulated and become activated and give off its own light, the light of the moon. However, here he reconciles it with the first opinion. Remember, I said before, there's an opinion that the moon is only a reflection of the sun, it doesn't have light of its own. Here, the Rebbe Rashab says it's both. Both are true. The moon, besides the fact that the sun is stimulating the light of the moon, that it should shine with its own light, like a teacher stimulating and activating the seichel of a student and putting him on his own feet, he says, in this moon, there's also Ir HaShemesh. However, yesterday I wondered what he meant by Kamei Ir Atzma. But clearly, he's saying that though the sun is also reflected, but the sun doesn't look like sunlight in the moon. Besides the fact that the moon has its own so-called light and glow, even the part of the sun that's in there also was changed. And I think that's what he means, Gamken Kamei Ir Atzma. You could say this means that it changed to become like moonlight, or you could say Mishtana Gamken Kamei Ir Atzma, that it changed from the way it was light of the sun on its own. It doesn't read correctly the second way I just explained it, but either way, the point is that the light has gone through a shift. So even if you're to say, or you should say, and also the light of the sun that enters the moon has gone through a shift. It's also now shining like the moon shines, not like the sun shines. So the moon does not look like the sun. It has its own form of light. That's why you could look at it. That's why he says in some places that actually the moon, there are certain plants that grow in this moonlight, not in the sunlight. The moon, for example, also impacts the tides, the gravitational pull, and so on. But I don't want to go into the details right now. The point is that the moon has its own power, but in the parentheses, he says it also has the sun, but the sun goes through a change. Okay. So now going back to the moon, Bahainu, Shibechinas Er Makabel. I'm learning inside. We learned this already, but again, I want to go over a little slower. Yesterday, I was rushing a bit at the end of the class. So he says, Bahainu. So I'm on line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On page 1353, line 5. I will stop in a moment for questions because I review this more in depth. Maybe there's some things that need to be clarified, but I just want to finish till the parentheses, one line. Bahainu, Shibchinas Er Makabel. So the moon, bottom line, is a light, a receiving light, but it's called a light. So there's also a moir, but it's a moir that works like a recipient. Like not like the sun, which is be'etzem mashpia. The sun is a source of light, period. And that's why the moon on its own, without the sun's activating, does not radiate on its own. That means less lamagam al klum. It has nothing of its own, meaning nothing of its own illumination until the sun activates it. Okay. Now there's going to come a parenthesis, which we began yesterday, but I want to go over it again, a little more slower and more in depth and more in detail. But I'll stop here if anybody wants to clarify anything. Remember, we're middle of a whole subject here, so it's far from finished, but it's being developed into, and I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how this connects to everything we learned earlier about the 3 levels of sweetening the bitterness and illuminating the dark. You really see the connections because we see here different ways that light functions. So it's really going to come together, I think, in a very powerful way. But it's also interesting that we're talking Teira Eir, Ner Mitzvah, Ner Neshama. So a lot of ways that we illuminate existence from the bottom up, from the top down, in between. So it's all part of developing that. So just bear in mind, this is far from a parenthetical discussion. This is very much the core essence of the interface of Ayin Beis, interfacing between the divine light and the concealed existence. But anybody want to ask anything, or you want me to continue? Okay. So let's go to the parentheses. So this is a parentheses with a parentheses within the parentheses. And like they indicate below where the second parentheses ends. So it's important because to really navigate properly, and keep our bearings here, we need to see the coordinates of these parentheses, where they begin, where they end. This parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab, is somewhat very condensed way to develop some of the issues of what are we talking about here when we say the moon and the sun are both luminaries, and yet they're so different in how they function. Because, and I'll just preface with a few, I'll put it as questions, but definitely things that need clarity. On one hand, it's been established that the moon also is a mo'er. The Torah says it. So you have to say it's a luminary. However, it's a mo'er hakot. Regardless now, we're not discussing now about the diminishing of the moon or not the diminishing. Even as the moon was created before it was diminished, it was a second mo'er. It wasn't the sun. There weren't two suns. It was Shnei Me'eres Tagdelim. One is the sun, one was a moon. The question is whether the moon was the same strength of the sun, but to say the moon was the sun, no. So you could say that this moon as an Eira Makabel was in its creation. It didn't become a Makabel after the diminishment. Now, he doesn't say it explicitly here, but it's pretty implicit in the concept. But we'll get back to that shortly. So number one, it's a moir. Number two, he said that's a moir, however, that doesn't radiate. The moon, that is, on its own. But the Torah says, the Shnei Me'eres Hagdeim l'choyer ala haaretz, to radiate on earth. Their function is to radiate. So you see, even the moon also has that function. So obviously, it's a little more complicated. So the answer is, the obvious answer, like he already explained, is yes, it does radiate, but it radiates only after the sun stimulates it. So in other words, the Torah is saying it radiates doesn't mean it radiates on its own. It means it radiates after the sun shines within. So to address all this, and one more point, we mentioned before that the sun has two elements. Not only does it illuminate the darkness on its own, a mashpia, the sun is also be'etzem amoir. In other words, it has something that doesn't even, it's a fundamental source of light, even if it doesn't illuminate. The fact is the sun does illuminate. But like we said before with Eish, there's the element of Eish, the archetype. It doesn't have to illuminate for be a source of light. You can have a source of light. For example, even in Lamaila and Ruchnius, you could say something is a source of light. That doesn't mean the thing itself is right now glowing. It's like the Mokara Oyer. Etzem Oyer doesn't radiate, but it's a source of light. It's a source of all Gili. So all this is going to be addressed in the parentheses, in addition to connecting it to its source. What exactly does this mean, Beruchnius? Till now, we've been talking all about this, how it manifests in physical items. Sunlight, the sun, the moon, bright stone, mashpia, makabel, teacher, student, the sight of the eye. He's going to now, in this parentheses, also give us a little taste of what it is in the Maila, in the highest levels, in how God reveals himself. That we're going to see there's two ways that God creates Oyer HaMashpia and Oyer HaMakabel in its root. All this is going to be covered in the parentheses. I'll go over it now slowly, so we'll be able to make sense of it. As I said yesterday, we began. We'll go through the details right now. And this, for the record, is not in the Maimer of the Mittler Rebbe and Pirush HaMilas, this parentheses, as well as the Sicha of Simchas Torah Samach Zayin and Torah Shalom from the Rebbe Rashab. This is V'nimtza, clearly the Rebbe Rashab elaborating on the ideas, and when you learn this, you actually understand Pshat better in those Maimer, that Maimer as well. So here's what he says, V'nimtza. So now that we've established that the moon is a moyer, but it doesn't radiate until the sun stimulates it or activates it. V'nimtza mashi b'chinas moyer. So now, how do we explain now the word mo'ir on the moon? Why do we call it a source of light? Hu b'chinas atzmi lo b'chinas oir. Before he used the word that it's ein la'oir hamispashet la'oir. What does that mean? So he's saying that it has an atzmi part to it. That's what makes it a mo'ir. The difference between mo'ir and oir is the source of light and light. But mo'ir and oir also has a different element. Mo'ir, like he said earlier, is an atzmi. And atzmi means it is an essential entity of its own. When you say something is oir, you're right away telling us that it's a reflection of something else. When you say the oir of seichel, or the oir of a bright stone, or the oir of the sun, you're saying sunlight. You're not saying that it is the source of light, it's the sunlight. It's a reflection of something. That's what oir means. When the Torah calls the Levana, if the Torah would have said, Moed Echad, one Moed, which is the sun, and the moon is light, oir ha-Levana, then you could argue that the moon is not an Atzmi. The moon wasn't created as a core entity. The moon was created as a reflection of the sun. Like something like another way, the sun gets reflected. But since it's called Moed, you're saying it has an element of Atzmi, that it is an entity, a self-contained entity. What type of entity is clearly different than the entity called the sun? Because the sun's entity, it consists of giving off light on its own and illuminating and everything the sun does. With the moon, it's an Atzmi, it's called a Moed, but like he says, Loi lebchinas oir, on its own. So the moon has a function. What is its function? Is to be a certain type of Moed, the Moed called a makabel. In other words, a makabel isn't just a recipient, a passive recipient, it's also a force. When a person puts themselves in the state of being a recipient, the student has seichel. Let's even say he's a brilliant mind, but he through his bittul, he's put aside his mind in order to absorb and receive from a great teacher. That's a very active effort. That's not passivity. That's not like sitting around and doing nothing. That requires tremendous amount of effort. So in that sense, it's also an Atzmi. It's a different type of Atzmi. There's an Atzmi whose entire role is to give. There's an Atzmi whose role is to receive. And receiving is not inferior to giving. In the world around us, in a world of capitalism, in a world of commercialization, then yeah, the one who's giving is the one in power. The one who's paying the money, the one who's the boss, the one that's giving is stronger than the one that's receiving. But that's only in a material world. Not in a real, in a world of MS, who says that's the case? Who says that the one that's receiving is weaker than the one that's giving? They're just two different entities. Remember, there's no ego here. The sun doesn't have ego, the moon doesn't have an ego. I'm not getting down to the diminishment of the moon. That's another discussion. But they're fundamental two entities created for the, one of the big topics when we talk about, I've given many talks, when people speak about, are women second-class citizens because men have certain rights and certain authority and so on. And the answer is that's ridiculous. God created the human being in the divine image, Zachar and Nekeva, male and female, and then split them into two. If there's bittul, it makes no difference who's the breadwinner, who's physically stronger. They both are fulfilling God's will. And when you're fulfilling God's will, there's no difference. If God wants you to be right now a giver, you be a giver. If God wants you to be a recipient, you're a recipient. Being a recipient is not weaker or inferior to being a giver. Simple as that. As we actually we have learned and we will learn, it's actually deeper. Because the Eira Makabel of Malchus reaches in the Etzem, that's deeper than the Gilui of Eir. But that we'll get back to. That's not so important to right now to emphasize, just to make the point. So the moon is Atzmi. However, it's not Eir on its own. That's what he's saying. Hashemesh. The Shemesh is also a Moed. It's also an Atzmi. Its form of Moed manifests also in illuminating. But that illumination doesn't define an Atzmi. Illumination defines the Atzmi that is the Moed of the sun, because that's what it was created for. So God said, you, the sun, I'm creating as an Atzmi to give off light, and you, the moon, I'm creating an Atzmi to receive, and then your light will be stimulated from within. They're both Atzmi. They're just different types. But now comes the issue. The Torah says that also the moon is called Lahoyer. It says, like I mentioned, Lahoyer ala Oretz. So that's the second parenthesis within the first parenthesis, which goes for 4 lines. You don't have it marked, but you can mark it if you want. The end of this second parenthesis is going to end on the line that begins b'mokem acher, after the words Oyer Lahoyer. So it's now going to qualify. So then what is the moon? What does it mean that the moon was also created to illuminate? Bahare gam belevono ksiv lahoyer. By Levono also it says lahoyer. So if that's the case, so how is it different than the sun? The Mashakosa Bayit Nesam Elikim lahoyer ha'aretz koil hashneim. Because when the Torah says that God created the Ma'oris Sagdelim, the two luminaries, and he placed them into heaven to radiate on the earth, he doesn't say that both of them should radiate, the sun and the moon. So that's like somewhat of a qualification. So what do we mean by that? Additionally, the other way around, the gam, the shemesh, yes, it's true. The way it's an atzmi and a moyer is also to give off light, but the sun also has something, just like the moon has an element of lahoyer to give off light, which as obviously he's going to explain, comes from the sun. The sun has an element that's also that's beyond light. It's called moyer. So how do you explain that? In other words, they're not mutually exclusive. The sun is just a moyer to give off light, and the moon is just a moyer that doesn't give off light. The moon also gives off light, and the sun is also a moyer that's higher than light. So he explains, the point is, what's primary and what's secondary, so to speak. I'm using my own words. He doesn't say these words, but he says like this now. So he goes like this. And so then how do we explain the word lahoyer? No, lahoyer means the sun is not just here to give off light, because then it would be lacking the atzmi part. The sun, the way it functions is through al yedei ha'er, lahoyer ha'yedei ha'er. In other words, that it's through light that it shines. That's what it seems like he's saying here. I need to do more research on this, but I would say right now, initially, my initial understanding of this is that there's two ways you could say the entire sun is just to give off light. He's saying, no, the sun is a moyer, is an atzmi, created to give off light, and lahoyer does means that that lahoyer hainu al yedei ha'er, that is through light that it expresses itself. But it's not that light defines it, because it does have an element of moyer that's higher than oyer too. And yet, by the sun, it's not in a state of that helam, meaning that the sun is a state of gili. It's true, it is a moyer that's higher than oyer, but to say that is completely concealed like the moon, no. V'gam harikola by b'chinas oyer lahoyer. And also, the sun has an element that includes within it a level called oyer lahoyer. So, if you think about it, Lamaila, it makes total sense, which he's going to say after the parentheses. Actually, now that I think about it, I may disagree with them. It could be the second parentheses also ends all the way at the end. I have to think about that. I think they got it wrong. Anyway, let me just explain. When you say Etzem ha'oyer, we learned earlier that the Etzem ha'oyer is higher than oyer. It's the power of God to give off light. That doesn't mean it has to be light. To say that God can give off light, you don't say God is defined by light. He doesn't have to give off light. He's able not to give off light. But he created a track that gives off light. So there's a few things going on here. There's the Atzmi part of it, which is the divine source of light. There's the actual power to illuminate, which is actual light that illuminates the dark. And it also has the element that it has the power. So even in the Atzmi, it also has the potential to radiate with light. That's all included in Etzem ha'oyer, in oyer. And therefore, it has all elements. The sun has an element of Atzmi, moyer. It has within it also the power to give off light, and it's not that much concealed as it is with the moon. That's how you can explain what he's saying in this parentheses. The thing is, what does it mean then that the moon is lahoyer? So you have to say the meaning is that the moon fundamentally is a helam. It's also an atzmi, but it's an atzmi that expresses itself in concealment. But it also includes in it the inyan of oyer, and that's when the sun stimulates it, the oyer comes out of it. Remember we learned earlier about the Rishimu, that the Rishimu has two aspects to it. it's complete concealment, the power of Helam. Helam Atzmi. But it also includes in it Oyer that's concealed in it. The Oyer is also there, and it can be drawn out of it. So you have both elements in the Rishimu, even in the Tzimtzum and the Rishimu. You have real concealment, and you also have Oyer, but the Oyer needs something else to stimulate it. So it could be that's what he's alluding to here in all of what we're saying here. But being that it's very short and dense, I have to think about it some more, because I was also thinking that you could say the same idea with the moon. You could say what he's saying, you could technically say the moon also, even though the moon on its own is concealed, has nothing of its own as far as shining light. But at the end of the day, it does have a light that could be stimulated, and we see the moon does glow once the sun activates it. But I don't think he's talking about the moon in this last few lines. I think he's talking about the sun. But I want to read it again and again, because you could interpret that he's talking about the moon. I think we'll understand it maybe better when we read the end of the parentheses, which I can't do right now because I have somewhat I must finish right now. But there's still the end of the parentheses where he talks about what it is lamaila, koyach hagili and koyach hahelim, which sounds to me the difference between the moon and the sun and the moon. But he doesn't state it explicitly. So we have to still figure out what that means. Does it mean in the sun there's a koyach hagili and koyach hahelim? I don't think so. Because what's the koyach hahelim in the sun? Unless he's saying the sun is like the etzem, and the etzem has a power to conceal and a power to reveal. No, I don't think so. I think he means the moon and the sun. That one is the koyach hagili and one is the koyach hahelim. But when you go to the etzem, even the koyach hagili has something that's higher than gili, but still relates to gili. And I'm not sure if everybody's getting what I'm saying, but I will definitely explain it more in the coming classes. So I'm going to stop here, middle of parentheses, but I think we made some progress. There's much more to discuss, but I'll stop for a few questions and then we'll sign off. If there are any questions.
You said in this, explaining this past few lines, there's such a thing as a mar that doesn't give off light. Is that what you mean by, for example, it's like the Levana, the moon, that it's called a mar in the Torah, but it doesn't intrinsically give off light unless the sun shines on it, and then it becomes a mar. Is that what you mean by a mar that doesn't give off light? Because out of context, you say a mar.
It's a mar because it's an Atzmi. As I said, the very power to receive is also an Atzmizdika power.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's another element, which is that the light that it gives off is coming from it. It doesn't become a mar after the sun shines in it. It's already a moyer from the beginning. The light, what it doesn't have the moon, is er hamispashet lahoyer, meaning the element of illumination, actual light illumination, but it has the atzmi power, a divine power. It's called a light. It's called a divine energy. When a person exercises the power of restraint, for example, or the power of tzimtzum, is that a moyer? He says, yes. That's the power of concealment. It's also power. It's just not a power that shines in a way that you can see it. Its expression is through not shining.
Yeah, but it seems like the very definition of ma'or is that it gives off light. That's the definition of ma'or.
Not necessarily. That's what he's explaining. That's not the case. He says that clearly on top. He says,
so you're defining ma'or as something that has the potential.
I'm not defining anything. I'm trying to understand the words of the Rebbe Rashab. Look at the words.
Okay, fine. I am. You're looking at the words too, multiple times, and it's not clear. But you're saying, the Rebbe Rashab is saying, a ma'or is something that may not necessarily be giving off light, but it has the capacity to give off light?
That's the difference between the sun and the moon.
Right.
The moon is called a ma'or. So he says, Ima yesu b'chinas ma'or, ein biyacholte lahoyer ma'atzma, ki im kasher tekabel. So I explained, so why is it called a ma'or on its own? Why is it not just called a reflector of the sun? Because that's also a power. That's also an atzmi, like he says in the parentheses. So he says, what is the word he uses? Nimtza, b'chinas moed, b'chinas atzmi, loy b'chinas oyer. That's what I was explaining. You see the words? V'nimtza mashi b'chinas moed, b'chinas atzmi, loy b'chinas oyer. So in other words, why I call them moed? Because it's an atzmi, like I spoke earlier about the archetype of fire. You can have etzem ha'oyer in the root of roots before the tzimtzum. It is not an illuminator, but it's a source of power.
Mm-hmm.
Like
That's
the
seemingly what he means.
like the black
That it's
pot,
an
the
atzmi, but it's
Karanisa.
not oyer. That's how I explained it. There may be other ways to explain it, but he does say that.
Is it like the
Mashi b'chinas oyer,
Karanisa?
b'chinas atzmi, loy b'chinas oyer. You see that?
Yeah,
You see
it's
that?
a tough one to understand. It's a tough one to understand.
That's why I'm giving a class and explaining it.
Yeah.
So I think I explained it. I definitely explained it in a way I think is adequate. There may be other ways to explain it. I'm more than happy to explore other ways. But that's one way to, but he does say that. So the question is, what does this mean, this line? So I explained it, what it means. The power of Helen is also an oyer, is also moyer. Oyer HaMakabel does not, I explained that length. Receiving does not mean that you're weaker. It doesn't have to be reveal light for it to be a moyer. That's the point. Anyway, we'll learn more. We'll learn it more. We'll go over it as much as we need to till we figure it out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's stop here. So we're stopping in the middle of the parentheses on page 1353. As I said, it's dense, and we need to go over it till we get it. I'll keep going.